The Winchester Mystery House in San Jose is California's best-known haunted house. Locals called it the Spirit House, and countless people have witnessed supernatural occurrences within its walls. Here, Sarah Winchester spent the final 38 years of her life building the 160-room mansion in a desperate attempt to appease the spirits of those killed by the Winchester repeating rifle. Her odyssey began after the untimely deaths of her husband and child. Grief-stricken, she consulted a spiritualist who told her that the deaths were caused by vengeful spirits, victims of the Winchester rifle. She was advised to move west and build a house large enough to contain them all. If construction ceased for even a moment, Mrs. Winchester would be their next victim. In an effort to confuse the spirits, she built twisting corridors, secret passageways, trapdoors, stairs leading to the ceiling, doors and windows that open onto walls, and a door that led to a 15-foot drop in the garden. The number 13 figured prominently in the mansion's construction. The greenhouse contains 13 skylights. Most of the staircases have 13 steps. The ballroom chandelier has 13 globes. And many of the sinks contain 13 drain holes. To reach the 13th bathroom, one must walk down 13 easy riser steps.
Now, this was one of the more modern rooms in the house. It had electricity and indoor plumbing. Right here, this is the only shower in this whole entire mansion. In Mrs. Winchester's later years, she had trouble getting out of the bathtub, so showers became a necessity. This device right here is a water thermometer, so Mrs. Winchester could have gotten the water to the temperature she wanted before stepping into the shower. Now, of course, in the 13th bathroom, there are 13 windows. We have 10 along the back wall, with the upper 6 in her favorite spiderweb design. There's 2 more in the wall behind me, and the 13th looks into Mrs. Winchester's main bedroom where she died. This is where she died on September 5th, 1922. She was 82 years old, and she simply died of heart failure in her sleep. As soon as she died, all working stopped pretty much on the house. The house was then sold in a private auction, along with most of her furniture. None of the furniture in the house is original. This picture here was taken before the 1906 earthquake. When the earthquake struck, this 7-story tower right here collapsed, along with much of this 5th floor area here, and it was never replaced. Right here, where these 2 men are standing, that's the 4th floor balcony, and it's now the highest point of the house after the earthquake. This picture does show the backyard of Mrs. Winchester's house. You can compare it to this picture over here, which was taken about 15 years ago. Even though this is the back view and that's the front one, you can still get an idea of how much things have changed. The earthquake struck on April 18, 1906 at 5:13 a.m. It was registered in 8.3 and was felt from Oregon all the way down to Los Angeles. Now, the 7-story tower, which used to be over in this corner, actually fell. It hit a chimney that was over here in the corner. This wall was supported by that chimney, so when it lost its support, it shifted in this direction. And right here, you can actually see the outline of how much the doorway shifted. This, of course, pinched the door shut, so Mrs. Winchester could not get out. Her servants took quite a while to find her, a couple hours in fact, and when they did find her, they had to crowbar the door open. And right here is the mark of that crowbar. Now, Mrs. Winchester thought that this was a message from the spirits saying she had spent too much time and money on the front part of the house, which was nearing completion. She had the front 30 rooms boarded up, and they are not open again until after her death in 1922. Now, a few years ago, there was 2 writers that stayed in this room to see if they could find any ghost stories or any ghostly happenings. In the middle of the night, one of them heard a phantom organ that sounded like it was coming from the ballroom. The other one did not hear it at all. Then a few minutes later, both of them felt the floor shaking rather violently. for several minutes until it stopped. In the morning, they checked the organ. They found out that it was broken. They also learned that there was no earthquakes the night before to cause the shaking that they had both felt. We're now on the 4th floor, which is the highest point of the house after the 1906 earthquake. From here you can see most of Mrs. Winchester's backyard. All the way down on the lawn is the crescent-shaped hedge, which held some spiritualistic meaning for Mrs. Winchester, and it also does point to the room where she died. Right over here behind me is the bell tower. The bell was rung at noon and 5 p.m. to call the servants in for their meals. Some townspeople say it was also rung at midnight and 2 a.m. to call and release the spirits for their seances.
Each night, Mrs. Winchester would move through her dark house, slipping through trick doors and secret passageways until she reached the Blue Room with its 13 coat hooks. There, she'd sit at the table and summon her ghostly advisors.
Now these spirits would tell her how to build their house. She would then write down the plans and give it to her carpenters the next day who had to interpret them. And this is how the spirit's house got built. Now she was the only person allowed in this room. She had the only key to the only entrance. There's the one entrance, but 3 exits. The first is the door behind us, right over there. The second is that door. But if you were to fall out that door, you take a nice 8-foot drop into a kitchen sink. Now the third is this door right here, and this is the closest we've come to finding a secret passage. It actually looks like a closet door, but once it's open, you can see there's a whole other room behind. Also, there is no latch or handle on this side of the door. So if you were to step through and the door closed behind you, there would be no coming back.
We did find Sarah Winchester haunting the house. There were 3 entities on site at the time. Sarah, a carpenter or a construction man that died on site during the building of the house, and a young woman that was one of Sarah's employees that was either a cook or a maid or so on. And all 3 remain in the house today.
We're in the servant's kitchen right up here. This is the shaft that leads from the seance room. If you were to go out that door that was up there, you would fall 8 feet right into this kitchen sink. We had a new office clerk going on tour who, in this room, as she was walking out there, she saw an old woman dressed in Victorian clothing sitting in this room. She asked one of the tour guides, why did we have someone dressed up as Mrs. Winchester? And the tour guide was like, we don't have anyone dressed up like Mrs. Winchester.
These entities are seen as apparitions mainly, where they're translucent and seemed to ignore us while we were there, did not want to communicate.
We're now in the twin dining rooms. This room here that's unfinished was actually being redesigned to look like this one over here to form a long banquet hall. Now, Mrs. Winchester supposedly did have banquets. She would invite 12 guests over. These 12 guests were ghosts, her being the 13th one at the table. Her servants were very puzzled as to why she would have 12 empty place settings, but they were pretty happy about it considering they got all the leftovers. Now right here, this is Mrs. Winchester's safe located in her ballroom. Supposedly it held her most valuable possessions, so naturally when she died, her servants came down here and broke the safe open to see what was inside. The only thing they found was a lock of William's hair, a lock of Annie's hair, and the obituaries from her husband and daughter's deaths. And this told us that they were what she held most valuable to her.
Sarah, as short as she was, it was very easy to decide that what we had seen definitely was her, and it's not a surprise to me that she would be haunting that house.